One of the more powerful ways that we can configure Sublime Text is via the use of a color scheme. Now, color schemes allow us to modify the visual style of the files that we're editing, which we might want to do to make things easier to read and understand just at a glance, or even just to make them look a little bit nicer and more pleasing. And color schemes are one of those topics that, even for more advanced and seasoned Sublime Text users, can be a little bit confusing because there is a lot going on there behind the scenes. So we are going to kick off a video series on the ins and outs of color schemes and how they work with this introduction to Sublime Text color schemes. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. ODAT Nerd here. Welcome to the first video of 2020 and the first video on Sublime Text color schemes. This is going to be the first video in a series of videos on color schemes, giving us a little bit of the basics on this particularly broad topic in Sublime Text, the different formats and what these files are actually for. And we're going to go into more detail on that in future videos. And before we get to the content of this video or those future videos, please do show your support by using the buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate if you're finding the videos helpful and informative. And don't forget, you can always use that comment section down below any video if you have any questions, comments, requests for clarification, even suggestions for other Sublime Text topics that you'd like to cover. But as I said, we are here to talk about an introduction to Sublime Text color schemes. And we're going to sort of give a broad overview here. We're not going to go into too many deep details. So don't worry, those are coming up in upcoming videos on the channel. But if you have ever looked at color schemes before and there were aspects of it that you did not understand or were unclear to you, you couldn't quite figure out what it was talking about, do drop that down in the comment section below and we'll make sure that we cover that particular aspect in those upcoming videos. And before we get to the actual content of the video at all, one more thing to point out is that this is one of those topics that is officially documented in the Sublime Text documentation, and links to that documentation are down in the description of this video and will be in the description of all of the other videos in this series for your reference. And with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the basics of Sublime Text color schemes. Question number 1. What actually is a color scheme in Sublime Text? That is an easy question to answer. A color scheme is a configuration file that we can provide to Sublime to tell it how we would like it to work. This is very similar to how the preferences file tells Sublime how we would like it to act and behave as we are editing files, and how the key map files tell Sublime how we would like it to react to the keys that we're pressing. Color schemes are an example of a configuration system that tells Sublime how we would like to visually see the content of the files that we're editing. Question 2, how do color schemes work? That is a more complicated question and why this is an introduction in a series of videos. Color schemes work hand in hand with syntax definitions, which are on their own a very large topic and not something we're going to cover in this particular series of videos. For our purposes here in this introduction, it's enough to know that a syntax definition contains the rules that tells Sublime how to recognize the content of a file and what that content is supposed to represent in the context of the language that it's editing. For example, this file that I have open here is a Python file. It's the exec plugin that comes from the default package. And if you watch the video on build systems in Sublime Text, then you will have seen this because it's what is used to execute build systems by default. And because this is Python, the syntax definition for Python is able to analyze the content of the file and determine that lines 16 through 21 are a class definition, and the names of the class and the names of the method are recognized, and the names of the parameters are also recognized. Even the special reserved word pass is recognized. That's all part of the syntax definition. Now, what the syntax definition is actually doing is applying one or more scopes to every character in the file. And scopes is another one of those things that pops up all the time in Sublime Text and is one of those topics that's pretty big. We're not going to cover this here, but there is a video on the channel that covers scopes, scope selectors, how they match, how they work. That's going to be integral to how color schemes work. So if you haven't seen that, you may want to watch that particular video as well. Now, we have seen this, for example, in the videos on key bindings, how you could create a key binding that applies in only a certain type of file or even in a certain specific location in a type of file. That is something that is done by using scopes and scope matching. One of the other uses for scopes is in color schemes. scopes because the syntax definition is applying the scopes to these files to tell us and tell Sublime what the content of the file means. The color scheme just contains rules that shows Sublime how it should display those visually, and we're going to see examples of that as well. It is important to note that there is a symbiosis that has to exist between the syntax definition and the color scheme that is in use. And in this example, this is the Python syntax that ships with Sublime and the Monokai color scheme that also ships with Sublime. The syntax definition in use is able to, with impunity, apply any scope it wants to any character in the buffer that it wants because it is the final arbiter. It's the thing that knows how to recognize the content of the file. However, the color scheme needs to be able to have rules that recognizes scopes to be able to color them. So if the syntax definition for Python doesn't apply a scope to the word class, for example, that the color scheme is capable of recognizing, then that word can't be syntax highlighted. And this can work in a couple of different ways. One of the more common questions that we get about color schemes in Sublime Text and modifying them is someone saying, there are certain words in my files that I would like to have a different color on. Is it possible to do that? And the answer to that is maybe. If the syntax definition doesn't apply some sort of scope to that text that allows the color scheme to specifically know that that's what it is, then you can't modify that text to have a particular color or style because there's the information to do that just isn't available. On the flip side, if the information is available in the syntax, but there's not a rule in the color scheme to target it, then it's not going to be visually displayed. But in that case, the problem is with the color scheme instead. So there is a little bit of a give and play. And when it comes to the scopes that are used by syntaxes, there is a guideline and recommendation for how languages should try to work where possible to make sure that they maintain maximum compatibility with all of the color schemes that are out there. There's also a link to that in the documentation as well, just because that could be handy when it comes to color scheme creation and things of that nature. The color scheme that Sublime Text uses is controlled by the color scheme setting, and there's a couple of different ways you can change that. One way, if you use the menu, is to go to the Preferences menu, and remember that's under Sublime Text if you're on macOS. There's an item in here labeled Color Scheme that you can choose. If you prefer to use the command palette, you can search for the UI Select Color Scheme command instead, and that opens this pop-up that shows the list of all of the color schemes that exist across all of the packages that currently have color schemes in them. And as you cycle through the items in the list, the color scheme is previewed so you can see what it's going to look like. If you push escape to close the box, then nothing is changed. Everything stays the way that it is. Alternatively, and this time I'm going to do it from the menu, when this panel opens, if you were to press enter to select one, that becomes the new color scheme that is in use. This has actually changed the setting for us. Now, again, if we were to come into this list, there's two different types of color schemes that don't appear in this list. The first of those is hidden color schemes. Now, a color scheme would be marked as hidden by the person who created it, and if they did that, it's probably because they know that they're using it for a very specific purpose and it's not useful as a general purpose color scheme. For example, a color scheme could be used to highlight and color display the output of a build system in the build panel, and if that's the case, there may not be a full set of color rules for all of the different languages that you might support because it knows it's only highlighting a very specific thing. Hence, you wouldn't want to use it as a color scheme in general because nothing would be syntax highlighted. So the author of that plugin has marked it as hidden. So it would be masked from this list. The other types of items which don't normally appear in this list but do appear right now are legacy color schemes. And we can see at the top of the list here, the Twilight and Zen Burns-esque color schemes are coming from the color scheme legacy package. And these are color schemes that used to be part of the color scheme default package as just default color schemes that ship with Sublime a little while ago, and they were moved to be legacy color schemes and put in a legacy package, and those color schemes don't normally appear in this list. And that has everything to do with that symbiosis I mentioned between the syntax definitions and the color schemes, because the syntax definitions are actively being maintained by the developers of Sublime and the Sublime text community. So they are getting better over time, better at recognizing text and applying scopes that allow for more impressive color syntax highlighting. But these color schemes, these legacy color schemes, as they are called now, were never really updated. So they aren't taking full advantage of that. And because they are very uncommonly used, they were moved to the legacy package instead. So they don't normally appear in this list. However, you can make them appear. And to do that, you would go to your settings. And again, this is also available from the command palette. This is just the standard settings. And we can see here, first of all, that there's a setting here named color scheme that is currently set to color scheme default Mariana.sublime color scheme. That is the global color scheme that is set. But we can also see down at the bottom of the file, there's a setting here I've added called show legacy color schemes, which is set to true. If that value is set in here, then those legacy color schemes will display in that list and allow you to choose one of them. So if those are the color schemes that you like to use, or if you're trying to go back to a color scheme that you used to use and you don't see it in the list, this could be why. Now, I'm using package dev here, and this isn't a setting that's outlined in that preferences setting on the left there. So that's why it's being displayed with that line underneath of it there. But you could use that setting if you want to get at those legacy color schemes. And you also don't need to use that UI at all. If you know the name of the color scheme that you're interested in, you could just set the value of the color scheme setting directly as well. And remember, you can always use view package file from the command palette and look for Sublime color scheme to find the names of all of the color schemes that exist. This will also show you the items from the legacy package as well, because they're just regular resources. And by just using the name of the item here, you could use that in the setting to get the one you want. And if you have watched the video on configuring Sublime Text, then you will know that the color scheme setting is an editor setting. And that means we can set it here in our preferences to set a global color scheme. But if we're using projects, we can apply it inside of a project so that items inside that project have a specific color scheme. So you could use that to determine whether a window contains one project or another based on the color scheme that it's using. You can also use it in syntax specific settings as well. So if you were a web developer, you could have a different color scheme applied to HTML files versus CSS or JavaScript files. It's sometimes common to have, if you're using specific packages for Markdown editing in Sublime Text, to have Markdown have a specific color scheme that is set up just for itself and things of that nature. If you haven't seen that video, you might want to go back and watch it. This is also an example of a setting that is a view-specific setting that can be set on a specific tab-by-tab basis outside of all of the other settings mechanisms. So for example, if I was to close that and then just quickly jump into the key bindings, we can see here when I maximize this, I have a key binding over here to the toggle settings extended command that we covered last month in the videos on simple plugins that can make your usage of Sublime Text a little more sublime. And I'm using that to toggle the value of the color scheme setting between Monokai and Mariana. So every time I push the key, that particular tab has its local color scheme changed. But as we can see, the left-hand pane doesn't change because this is a view-specific setting. So this is also something that you could do if you found that sort of thing useful. Question 3, what does a color scheme file actually look like? This is also fairly easily answered, although interestingly enough, there are two different types of color scheme files that exist. The first color scheme format that we're going to talk about is a legacy color scheme format. Now, that doesn't mean that this isn't something that Sublime doesn't support anymore. It still loads and works with these files just fine. We're calling them legacy color scheme formats because they have been replaced and supplanted by a newer, more enhanced color scheme format that has more features. And that's something we're going to talk about in just a second. However, these color schemes are still out there. They still work just fine. You may be using one, you may run across them. So it's important to know a little bit about how they work and be more familiar with them. So, and because these are legacy color schemes, I'm just going to use a view package file to dip into those legacy color schemes that we talked about just a second ago and load up the cobalt.tm theme. Now, the extension here, TM theme, comes from TextMate theme. This is a TextMate color theme. And this can cause a little bit of confusion because it has the name theme in it that makes you think that this is an application theme, and themes in Sublime Text, actual themes, which are the topic of videos that we'll be making at some point in the future, style the overall application as a whole and are different from color schemes. So there could be a little bit of confusion there. TM theme is a color scheme format, not a theme format. This is sort of a naming thing. But as we can see, this is an XML file, and specifically if you are a Mac OS developer, this is a plist file in XML format. But for everybody else, it's enough to know that it is just XML, and that is actually the syntax that Sublime uses for this by default. And the content of this file is set up into roughly 3 sections, if you will. At the top of the file here, we have various keys and values that give information like the author of the color scheme, what it's named, and a comment of information that might be informative. The remainder of the file is contained in this settings key, and the top group of the settings key are what we would refer to as the global settings, if you will. Now, these particular values here, the first thing to point out is this color scheme format requires you to specify colors in RGB hex format. And if you're a web developer, you should be right at home with this particular thing. And we can see here that this is specifying things like the background color, the foreground color, the color of invisibles, which is the color that is used to display white space when you select it and or it's displayed, and things of that nature. The color of selection, the color that's used for line highlight, and so on. There's a large number of items that can appear in here. We're not really going to cover that here. That is listed in the documentation that's linked in the description, though. So the background and foreground color that is specified here specifies the background color and the color of text that doesn't have any other formatting applied. So for a plain text file, this would specify those colors. The remainder of this file is a list of those color rules that we have been talking about that tells Sublime in what situations it should apply new styles and what those styles should actually be. And these work, and there's 3 different items in each individual rule. The first item in here is the name of this rule, which is purely informative for our purposes. It doesn't have to be in the file, but it helps you as you're looking at the file be able to know what that rule is actually for. The next item is the scope that it should be matched if this rule is going to apply. And then following that is the settings, which allows us to change these format of the text that's being displayed. And what we can change here is whether or not the text is bold or italic, or just regular if bold and italic aren't specified. And we can also modify the foreground color and the background color. And if you don't modify the foreground, then the global foreground color applies. If you don't modify the background, the global background color applies. All that sort of stuff like that. And this scope here is the interesting part of this. This is what powers this entire system. And again, scopes are something that's outside the scope, pun mildly intended, for this video. But there is a video on the channel that goes all about, talks all about scopes and scope selectors, and this is a prime use of that particular action. So as Sublime is going through the document rendering it, it looks at each individual character for all intents and purposes, checks these rules, sees which one of these rules matches, and applies that style to that text. And in the specific case that there are more rules in here, there are multiple rules that match match, the one that scores the best is the one that will be used. But again, that's a topic that we're going to talk about more in a future video. So as we can see here, for example, we can do things like change the text style to be bold. We can change the text style to be italic. And we can also modify the foreground and background color as well. And this file contains a large number of these particular rules. Most color schemes do. The idea is because there are common scopes that are used, there should be used rather by all of the syntax authors that are out there doing things. You want to come up with a list of rules in your color scheme that matches all of the key ones so that no matter what type of file you're editing, you have good syntax highlighting. Although, of course, if you work more on one type of file than another, you could bias your color scheme more towards the constructs in that particular file type as well if you wanted to. The second type of color scheme file that can exist is the Sublime color scheme file. This is a newer color scheme format. It can do all of the same things as the TM theme file can, but it has more enhanced capabilities that make it a better solution in a lot of cases for working with color schemes. And because it's the default, we're going to look at the monokai.sublime color scheme file, which I'm going to just open by using the view package file command and filtering down and choosing it. And the first thing we can see is that this is a JSON file, so at least to my eyes, it's a lot easier to read than the XML plist version of the TM theme file. I should also point out that I'm using the package dev package here, so the syntax highlighting here is enhanced. If you don't have that package, the content of the file will look the same if you're using the same version of Sublime as I am, but the syntax highlighting won't look as nice. Just another example of how package dev can really enhance your usage of Sublime, even if you're not a package developer. The name can perhaps throw you off, but it really is just a top-notch package. And the top keys in here are providing the same sorts of information as the other file did, the name of this color scheme and what its author is. We're going to skip over this variables section for just a second to jump down to this global section where we can see keys that are very similar to the ones that we saw in the settings at the top of the TM theme file. Things like the foreground color, the background color, and the invisibles color. For example, we can see here as well, this color scheme has more things in it because it's not a legacy color scheme. It's being updated more recently than that legacy color scheme was, so it has more items in here. But the other thing we might notice is the colors that we are defining in here aren't in that RGB hex format. They could be, but there are a lot of other ways to define colors as well, and that's one of the things we'll be covering in other videos in this series. But let's skip for a second up to the top of the file again to look at this section on variables here, because this is something that's new in this particular type of file. This is not an analog to this in the TM theme format. And what this allows us to do is create named variables by specifying a color, again, in one of a variety of different ways. Here we're using hue, saturation, and luminosity, I think, or luminance. I can never remember what the L in that stands for, to specify colors by name. And then down in that global section, we can do things like, say, the foreground color is defined by the variable white, or we can say that the invisibles color is a color that's derived from the variable white, but with the alpha transparency turned down to make it dimmer. And similar things are also afoot in other parts of this, as we'll see. And this is an amazing feature because if the variable white3 is the foreground color, there could be any number of things, not just the invisibles, but other things that might relate to the foreground color being white. Or there could be a whole class of items that are derived based on the fact that they are, for example, some shade of orange. And you might want some things to be a lighter shade and some things to be a darker shade. If you were using a TM theme file, then you would have to manually enter those RGB hex codes for each one of those scopes. And if you later decided, I don't like the base color that I used here, then you have to edit that base thing and then go and find all of the colors that are sort of like that color, close to them and modify them as well. Here in the Sublime color scheme file, because we can use something like a variable, we can say that we define the color once, use it, modifying it with alpha transparency and other types of things in other usages. And then if we decide, you know what, I'd really like my foreground color to be more of a brownie color than a whitey color, you just change the value of that variable named white to be a different color, and everything just automatically updates. This also makes it a lot easier to see what rules are deriving from some particular color, because here we can see that the color of invisibles is an alpha transparent version of the white color. If we were doing this with the RGB version, it might be harder for us to determine that that was actually the case. Now, when it comes to the actual rule content of the file, we can see this is also a lot easier to see as well, because these JSON objects really reduce a lot of the redundancy that we might see. So we can see, like the other examples, we can see whether or not this rule is modifying the color of the foreground and background, and these other rules here can be modifying things like whether it is bold or italic and things of that nature. That's going to do it for our brief introduction to Sublime Text Color Scheme. So this is a little bit of a longer video, and there's still a lot of detail to cover. So if you're a little bit confused by some of the things that we discussed here, don't worry. We are going to be going over all of this stuff in future videos on the channel. And you want to make sure that you subscribe if you haven't already, so that you don't miss out on those videos when they come. Don't forget to show your support by using the buttons to thumb and share as you deem appropriate as well. You can also always use the comment section below if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for other Sublime Text video topics. But until that next video on Sublime Text color schemes, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.